Namaste and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake, lie, or imagination. So Sattology builds your identity and mythology destroys your identity. Use the word Sattology for your ancient history coming from Ramayana, Mahabharata, or Vedas. Any American who follows the Vedic culture should also use Sattology word extensively instead of mythology, because the Vedic knowledge, and in my books I have proved Ramayana Mahabharata history is real and and it is verifiable. I have verified with my limited knowledge, what to speak of others who can do much more. So I have very special guest. You all love him, and let us welcome Dr. Ankit Shah.
Namaskar.
Uh, uh, Ankit, China, if you look at the Mahabharata, China is always paying taxes. Four references of China paying taxes. And China is the small region towards the east, towards the coast, very small region. And
Mhm.
above China is Khasa, which is Mongolia as well as Beijing and other areas, and Dalian. But somehow today, the mostly we see in the American media that China is the number one enemy, and this is what is going on. But what we see on the ground is China never fights. The last time it fought was in 1962 with India, and after that, many small wars they lost. Vietnam they lost terribly, and so why does China doesn't fight?
Yeah, very interesting question. First we need to know that this entire 1962 debacle, why exactly it happened. So, 1962 was a precursor to what started in 1965, what we call as the Cultural Revolution. So, the Chinese Communist Party, in its CPC of 1962 itself, had decided on the Cultural Revolution that they were supposed to begin in 1965. So 1962 war was actually a compulsion for China to give a physical punch so that all the Chinese citizens would lose pride in the Indian religious practices and customs, especially the Buddhism, which is, as we know, that India influenced many religious practices across the border within China. So, in order to finish off all the religious stuff, they had to first give a physical punch so that the pride is lost. And then they started a brutal cultural revolution within China, finishing off all the religious and festival, all those kind of practices, which were all basically Indian subcontinent influenced one. Uh, you will realize that Hu Shi, the ambassador of China to the United States several years before 1962 commented that India has culturally, dominated China uh, for centuries without firing a bullet across. So, in order to finish off the India influenced religious practices, they had to do this 1962 stuff to justify to its people that you don't need to keep any kind of pride with the kind of practices that you follow, the traditions that you follow, which are India influenced. And then in 1965, the brutal cultural revolution started. So this is the background. This was their internal requirement for starting the cultural revolution, that they had to fight with the Indian army. Now, after that, there's some exception like Vietnam. Otherwise, you have never seen this particular Chinese PLA fighting any real war. And in fact, even at the LAC standoff, you see that when push came to shove on the nights of the week ending August from the Indian side, the PLA stunningly retreated. As a result, India occupied several high positions at the face of value. So this was a second loss of face for the Chinese after the Galwan debacle. And we also saw what happened in Arunachal recently. So there is not one country that does not want to see an India-China war. But if any of these two countries are intent on war, there is no one stopping them. China generally does not attack a prepared enemy. And why would it delay if it wanted to war with India? Like, let India prepare, cancel out, or toughen the winning probabilities by the sheer strength of numbers that it has? It just makes no sense. So I believe that this no weapon use policy, despite all the conflict that we have at the LSE and the physical tussle that both the forces face off with each other, the no weapon use policy still continues. So that agreement is still on, and PLA also keeps maintaining that no weapon use policy. Now, when a country does not have some bare minimum of democratic values, it isn't a surprise. The majority of its security has to concentrate inwards rather than outside. Now, when they boil up the borders all across with the neighbors, it's more of a conflict within the Chinese Communist Party in order to cater to those requirements that these borders are all fired up. Now, the Chinese PLA is not a battle hardened force with any big war experiences and does not have any kind of operational records to showcase, except for the arm twisting of the armless citizens inside China. You also know that the Chinese forces are made up of 70% of the single child of their parents. So single children are considered not only pampered but also unfit for army jobs for psychological reasons. So even psychologically, the PLA men do not match the physiologically the average vital statistics of the armed forces of most countries in terms of if you check the height, weight, and the physical endurance. So you'll find that in the Himalayas they will have to go with the oxygen tanks and etc. Now many of them cannot sustain at the heights of Tibet or the Himalayan winters, even for a football match without a regular oxygen supply. Forget about a war. Now, with massive unrest within China and anti-CCP sentiments in various pockets of China, it is very likely that in an event of war, the parents of this single child army men would implode the country from within, which is exactly why no parent would want their only child sacrificed for the cause of strengthening a political party instead of a nation. This is the only army which is aligned to a political party, not the nation. So all PLA members are Communist Party members, not a surprise. And it is something unfathomable for armed forces any country of the world to have complete alignment with a political party. So what this also implies that the promotions in the forces are at the mercy of loyalty and allegiance to the party leaders rather than being based on merit or military capability. This is one of the most suicidal features of the Chinese army in a war scenario because if the generals give up, the men would follow. Even they will lay down their arms. So the generals of PLA, you will find that they are transferred more frequently than any other armed forces in the world because these transfers are ordered at the whims of the party without any military cost benefit calculations on the decision. Now, this literally stems out from the political requirements of the leaders in power to keep control continuing rather than for any military betterment objective. So you find that the PLA is not immune to the purge, which the so-called chairman for life, Xi Jinping, is rolling out. He initiated the so-called reform of the PLA as a tool for the purge of top generals whom he doubted to be against his policies. And armed force involved with the political or business ambitions of a few in the governance is a disaster because their control alignment with particular factions would impact the performance at war. So the dependence of several army generals on separate political factions and heads sitting in Beijing for making battlefield decisions is very dangerous. So you never know which faction in the army could be interested in losing the war. So this is all internal CCP conflict playing out in open. This is exactly why they would never go for a war. And the Chinese army has a few bilateral friends to actually boast of. It is a pariah in the parlance of joint war exercises with modern forces or the powers of the world, particularly the West. It is not allowed to mingle and kept in total isolation from the command and control or the operational insights uh, of the modern warfare. Perhaps this can be attributed to the lack of trust factor of the Chinese polity. among the Committee of Nations, barring Pakistan, North Korea, and little crumbs of the Russian military experience sharing. The PLA stands home alone. So they do not have this bonhomie or modern tactics learning exercises with major nations of the world. About 20% of the total training time of the PLA goes into learning communism of Lenin and Karl Marx. So domestic political compulsions of aligning the PLA with the party are costly beyond doubt. Even the countries where Lenin and Marx belong don't do this to their forces. And the quantity of toys and men does not work on the actual battlefield. It is more about the fight in the men, which is a qualitative aspect.
You know, on our show, we have very good researcher. Your video is off. Um, can you hear me? Yeah. So
Yeah.
on our show, there's a Professor Kusumlata Kedia. She's written many books and she's very well respected amongst the educated people of India. And I find her to be really
Mhm.
deep analyst. She has in many shows on our channel. Now she pointed to something very interesting based on her own book that the Chinese Communist Party, if you look at the history, was created by the West to counter Japan. And that was the history beginning of the Chinese Communist Party. And we also know that the United States, despite having all kinds of opposition to China, never put any sanctions on China till date. And whenever India is rising, they have they were very happy when Chinese Communist Party was bribing political parties in India. They were very happy. Everyone was quiet. Everyone knew, but they were quiet. And
Mhm.
also the if you look at the media reports generally in the American newspapers, they start counting the ships of China and the military capability of China, but nothing is mentioned about the seventh fleet permanently being stationed in the South China Sea. Almost. It's been deployed for more than 2 years now. So, and the Spratly Islands, we know the Philippines Spratly Islands, which China built an aircraft. I mean, it's a land-based aircraft carrier, but it's right. The island is the aircraft carrier right there. So, all these postures of China, mostly the threat comes from the media, and we also see the Indian soldiers having no fear of China, no fear. So, the whole thing doesn't make sense to a ordinary person. So how
Mhm.
come India can stand up and the West is creating a fear at the same time not stopping the trade? Trade is going on. Like on an average American port, average American port, I'm talking about the large ports which receive imports, all are 60 to 70% filled with Chinese ships.
Mhm.
So how does a normal person understand this?
So, a lot of the fear mongering about Chinese army being a powerful army is a media blow up kind of a stuff. And the West has been particularly had a big role in doing it because even if you talk to some of the Western people, experts right now, they will say India needs a sixth generation aircraft. Now, if you ask them for what reason, then they would point out at China. So I believe that this entire this creation of a Chinese monster is a paperwork, frankly speaking, for making kind of defense deals and those kind of stuff. Uh, Even recently, you find that United States passed a resolution saying that Arunachal Pradesh is an Indian geography. So this kind of continuous, pin pricking continues from the West, trying to spoil relations between India and China, um, because they already know that the trust factor is very less between the two nations, and they exploit this particular stuff of between India and China. And we all know that the Chinese Communist Party exactly was a kind of U.S. deep state office sitting in Beijing. The entire manufacturing giant and the export giant that China became was because of the United States help. As we all know, as soon as euro currency was launched, China was brought into WTO by United States and all the benefits given, which is why, and trained the CCP cartels for free trade, which is why China has become the export giant that it became. So this alliance is very clearly visible, and I, for one, believe that the economics is the proof. So if you are economically strengthening a country, then that's your real ally. Which is why I say Chinese Communist Party, US, UK, and Pakistan Army. This is the only real alliance in the world. Until now, that was the only one. So irrespective of what different NATO and Quad and all this stuff that the United States does, I'm very clear about it that the CCP, US, UK, and the Pakistan Army. This was what the alliance which was going on last 40, 50 years. Now, if you look at the PLA, opening up multiple theaters at a time and being belligerent to all the neighbors and weaving them together to pose a united anti-China economic or military front doesn't look like a war strategy either. The war principles of Sun Tzu, their expert, probably did not inform the Chinese about the importance of sequence in a long-term war plan, or that the principles would backfire if applied on its own citizens first. Uh, they're applying Sun Tzu principles on their own people, right? And repeated failures to acknowledge the number of martyrs after a fight. You find that even after Galwan, you still don't know the real numbers of the PLA casualties which were faced. So, suppressing the information from parents and citizens about the PLA attempts at the border and refusing even the last honors of the supreme sacrifice of the martyrs kills the morale of the forces even further. So the news of more loss at borders would incite a backlash among the citizens and more questions on the CCP PLA tango that goes on. And the loss of face worldwide can cause the demand for dilution of the power of Xi Jinping within the powerful Politburo of the party, which is exactly why you see that they do not go into any real war with anybody. And they would rather, you know, conjure up internal conflicts within nations rather than do a real war physical at the physical borders with any of the countries. And these rogue regimes, as we all know, are experts in information warfare. Mostly, this is meant for domestic consumption and manipulating public opinion. But for external handling, we see that the Beijing uses, a kind of unpredictability in policy and warfare. And it is important to note that the unpredictability works only until the other side remains predictable, right? So surprises like the one given by India at the standoff in Ladakh will inspire several other tiny neighbors to try the dragon. So China's ventures in the South China Sea is proving to be too early, and at the Indian borders, probably too late. I mean, if I was Xi Jinping, I would have done during the Manmohan era, whatever, if at all I wanted to do something. So it's too late for trying anything at the Indian borders. Now, this strategic miscalculations prove that the PLA is too busy liberating people inside China to be ready for the dynamics of a full spectrum war outside, which is why I believe that they are never going to have a full scale war with any country.
No, one of the interesting things you say is in India, the first time that China was named as a public threat number one, military threat, was by George Fernandez. And
Hmm.
everybody knows that when he said that, and that was a pivotal moment for India to move to the north, focus on the northern borders. And also, Chinese have consistently occupied territories of India. I mean, they are sitting on it, they're building railroads on it, and the airports sitting on Indian territory in Aksai Chin, military airports. So, which is a real threat to the Indian Indian interests actually, and also the Karakoram Highway, which is built on entirely on Indian land. Tibet itself, I personally consider it to be part of India all the time because of the cultural as well as the historical connections, and nobody can divide the land whimsically the way Indian government gifted to them practically, you know. And so all these are tough points, and we all know the Indian psyche that it is sitting in their head. One leader will come in the future, and he will reverse everything. The entire pacifist stand of India. India is the most, you can say, peaceful, loving nation, you can say, because India has not taken proactive stance, but it will change. Public opinion is changing. That so, how do you see if India were to take a proactive action against all these occupied territories, from right from Lhasa to the Mongolian border, all the top, entire Tibet? So, if you remove Tibet, then it's almost like one fifth, one sixth of Chinese land. Is a
Mhm.
huge area. Well, not one sixth, even one fourth of Chinese land. So, uh, will that ever happen? And if that happens, then Chinese Communist Party, which is the Chinese PLA, PNA, whatever they call it, is part of Communist Party of China. So how will they react? Because they have no fighting soldiers. They're all politicians plus soldiers fighting together.
I think, recently, if you see the kind of statements coming off from the Chinese envoys, they've been telling that if India Pakistan resolves their issues, then India China can also resolve issues on the same format. So probably, I believe, as I've already always said, that the solution of LAC is at LOC. Actually, it's not at LAC. So if you finish the POK homework, I think the Chinese will fall in line. At least they would be negotiating in a serious way about the borders. And I believe that there is another issue with respect to the LAC, which is why you see none of the government officers would ever talk about LAC discussion in a serious way, because until you finalize the waters, you cannot finalize the borders, right? So I believe that about 10 plus nations which rely on waters flowing from the Tibetan plateau, they will have to first make an alliance and get a water sharing agreement negotiation kick-started with the Chinese Communist Party. Once that water sharing agreement is done, that is the point in time when India-China border, there can be serious discussions about what lies where. So until then, I do not believe, until the waters are secured, I do not believe that there would be any kind of kinetic action on at the LAC. And especially, you should be first completing your POK homework.
No,
Once that is done.
in Kali Yuga, people don't go for permanent solutions. This so irony, like if you read Narad Muni, if you read other Mahabharata, you don't see permanent solutions being created. Now, if it was any of the rulers of the past of India, they would have first controlled the source, then they would have controlled everything. Because in Indian culture, if India was controlling these rivers, then nobody will be fighting, because India has been, even the Indus Water Treaty, India has not implemented fully, because they
Mhm.
believe in the kindness of sharing. But when you come to these kind of countries, like where Chinese Communist Party, I'll say not China, the Chinese Communist Party and these kind of regimes, these are the real regimes which are dictatorial. They always use natural resources as a leverage. The whole world is fighting over natural resources. You know that better than me, in terms of how in every part of the continent the fight is on natural resources. And it goes so much against the Sanatan Dharma principle, Isha Vasyam Idam Sarvam, so much against goes there. Where the thing which is given to the entire humanity by God, and it is being so randomly distributed, and artificial scarcity created, so that people fight. you know Africa, take any continent for example, and the faulty philosophies which are meant for civilizational change, we have seen that starting from 1492, gold glory and god papal bull. And there we see that the exploitation of the whole world for natural resources and for a wealth of a few. So now this is a fault of this age. We can say that this is a fault of this age, where people are fighting over things which are not meant to be fought over. Now, if you look from that perspective, doesn't it make sense for India to control the source of these rivers? Because if there is a strong political leadership, we can do that. The modern European states, nation states concept is not worked. it's created only conflicts because they've created maps out of rulers, and we all know how CPC is actually supported by the West. So, will CPC be allowed to stop waging a war? It's not matter whether they can fight a war. That is a different. You have already answered that question. But will they be allowed to stop creating wars?
So, a lot of Chinese Communist Party leaders, they go up the rank to leadership by being totally mum about the policies that they are going to, or views or opinions that they personally have. So if you observe Xi Jinping, you will realize that he was totally meek, totally mum all across the time until he became what he became. So because there's a lack of trust factor in the Chinese Communist Party, nobody reports correct information to the top. Neither the top gives any correct information to the bottom. So I believe that a lot of confusion always would remain in terms of what kind of communication they do across the party cadres, including the PLA, which is one of the factor why they do not go for war as well. Um, and I believe that once this entire de-dollarization process picks up, I believe that there will be a point in time where Russia, India, and China will have to sit together and define uh, their respective sphere of influences where no other country would muck around that sphere of influence. So if you talk about India, influencing Sri Lanka, then the Chinese will have to withdraw their influences from the Sri Lankan nation. So I believe that a lot of that thing is possible, where India would withdraw a little bit of interference in the South China Sea, where they would withdraw some kind of interference in the Indian Ocean. This is very much possible. But what remains is a question about the LAC and the Tibet. That is what we call the rooftop of the world, which is the largest source of fresh water anywhere on this planet. So that remains a big point of contention between the two nations, because these waters could be, not just used as for water wars. It can cause famine, it can cause floods, and the entire. It's not just about drinking water; it is also about the industries which are developed over there because of that water supply. So a lot of northern India is dependent on the waters which are flowing from the Tibetan region.
You
So I
know,
think it's a complicated issue.
normally no industry should be allowed to be built around the water source. Normally, because the it pollutes a lot of things, and generally, even if you look at the old, it's not that during Mahabharata or Ramayana period there were no industrial centers. Industrial centers are always there, but they were made inland, so that doesn't
Hmm.
pollute the water. Or they were built on tributaries, not on the distributaries, not the tributaries. So that it doesn't pollute the water source. I think that wisdom is already there. People must be thinking about it. The Ganga Nahar is a good example where they have done a good work on industries are built on Ganga Nahar, not on the main river, which is a good
Hmm.
thing because that's how you stop the pollution. Now, one last question on this thing, the nuclear capability, which is oftentimes people see because that is the principal driver of all conflicts today. That if you have a very strong nuclear posture, then the wars can be prevented. We see that in Russia and Ukraine and US today. So China is ramping up the nuclear forces. Why there is a need for that?
Hmm. So the Chinese look at maintaining the minimum deterrence with respect to United States, and India looks at maintaining the minimum deterrence with respect to the Chinese. So, which is why India has developed the triad nuclear capacity, and we can deliver a nuclear weapon up until Beijing and even across, I believe. So, this kind of deterrence becomes an umbrella, security throughout the region, which is why you see none of the countries would be interested in kicking up a actual physical, full scale, full spectrum conflict at any of the theaters, because the nuclear war is what it will finally go into. Because say suppose a country like India and China would have a full scale conflict, there is no outcome except mutual destruction. And some of the Indian interlocutors clearly told the Chinese, even during Doklam and even during the LSE stand-up, that if a war is imposed, then Delhi will ensure that Beijing goes down along with Delhi. This was openly communicated to them. So I believe that obviously this nuclear power gives a kind of a blanket security throughout the region, that needless wars do not get started.
Yeah, I wanted to make that the last question, but one thing also came up is that when we look at the Europe, the West, I'm just saying West is US and UK. The rest, all other countries are, they don't take the initiative and
Mhm.
they all want peace. Uh, the if you look at the uh, so India's future threat will come from the Western nuclear forces, not Chinese nuclear forces, because
Mhm.
The West has used nuclear weapons, and there is a precedence of that, and there is a
Mhm.
precedence of them destroying large cities through aerial bombardment. China doesn't have that precedence. No other country has that precedence, including Russia. Only in the case of wars they have done that, but the West has that precedence. So, so, and we are talking way in. I mean, when you're working on strategy, you have to take into account every single aspect. So, does the Indian planners also have that in mind ever occur to them that
Well, when we are increasing the length of the delivery of our weapons in terms of missiles, 5,000, 8,000, 10,000, 12,000 kilometers and whatnot, I think we are covering a lot of Western. We are planning to cover a lot of Western regions as well. So, and we as Indians, we already know from our history that Indian Ocean has always been the main battlefield, always has been. So, finally the war is going to come down. Whenever the war comes, it comes down in the Indian Ocean, which is why you see that the Andaman Nicobar and those facilities would be equipped with, all kind of lethal weaponry that India possesses. And I believe that a lot of the Western experts, all strategists also know that India is going to be the next threat and it's not going to be China. So India is growing up to that position. And by 2047, as we all know, that when we sit back on the throne, it's going to pain a lot many countries. And the Western policy has always been to pit, rank 2, 3, 4 against each other so that they are able to maintain rank 1. So we are prepared. We are preparing for that as well.
thank you so much, Ankit, for coming on the show, and thank you all the viewers for watching it. Do like, share, subscribe, and I will announce it correctly. I don't know how it's going to happen. We'll have a lot of Ankit shorts coming on the show as well on our YouTube channel. So you can watch his clips because many things he says have come true. And most of the things, in fact, including the last one, which came out with Hanumanji on the tail of HLFT 42. And by the way, I follow aircrafts a lot. It's one of my passions since the age I was 5. So I know I can recognize most of the planes by looking at their belly. Which plane is that? So thank you very much, Ankit, and thank you all the viewers
Thank
for watching the show. And let us know your feedback. Namaste.